January 1945, somewhere in Lower Silesia. The temperature has not climbed above freezing in 11 days. Behind double rows of barbed wire, a German Stalag sits buried under a gray winter sky. Snow clings to the rooftops of wooden barracks. Guard towers rise above the compound like skeletal fingers. Beneath them, men in threadbare Wehrmacht uniforms stand watch, older men, most of them. Some are wounded veterans pulled from hospital beds. Others are barely trained reservists. Their coats are patched. Their boots are cracked at the soles. They have not tasted real coffee in over a year. Inside the compound, a low murmur spreads through the rows of bunks. Word has traveled fast. A Red Cross truck has arrived at the main gate. Within the hour, American prisoners of war begin unpacking 11-pound cardboard boxes. Out come tins of Spam, cans of salmon, bars of real chocolate, packets of roasted coffee, powdered milk, sugar cubes, cigarettes, 5 full packs per man, liver pate, raisins, soap, and vitamin tablets. The guards watch from the wire. No one speaks. There's nothing to say. The men holding the rifles have not eaten this well in months. Some of them have not seen chocolate since 1943. Their families at home are surviving on adulterated bread, ersatz coffee brewed from acorns, and rations that shrink with every passing week. And yet here, behind their own wire, under their own guns, the prisoners eat better than the guards. This is not a story about cruelty. It is not a story about luxury. It is the story of what happens when a nation wages a war it can no longer sustain, and how a quiet cardboard box exposed the fracture, lines of an empire collapsing from within. To understand how a German prison guard could stand in silence watching his own prisoners eat better than he did, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the moment the first Red Cross truck rolled through a Stalag gate, but to the agreements signed long before the first shot of the Second World War was ever fired. In 1929, delegates from 47 nations gathered in Geneva, Switzerland. The world was still haunted by the memory of the Great War, the trenches, the gas, the millions of men who had vanished into captivity with no rights, no protections, and no guarantee of return. The result of that gathering was the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. It was not a perfect document, but it laid down rules that would shape the next global conflict in ways no one yet imagined. Among its key provisions, prisoners of war were to receive food rations equivalent in quality and quantity to those of the detaining power's own garrison troops. They were entitled to send and receive mail. They were to be housed in conditions no worse than those of the soldiers guarding them. Medical care was to be provided. And critically, neutral organizations, particularly the International Committee of the Red Cross, were granted the right to inspect camps and deliver humanitarian aid. Germany signed that convention. So did the United States, Great Britain, France, and Canada. The Soviet Union did not. That single fact, who signed and who did not, would draw a line through millions of lives over the next 16 years. It would determine who received a cardboard box of food and who starved to death in a frozen ditch. When war broke out in September 1939, Germany initially held relatively few Western Allied prisoners. The fall of Poland, the invasions of Denmark and Norway, and the early campaigns in Western Europe brought in waves of British, French, Belgian, and Dutch captives. By the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, Germany held nearly 2 million prisoners of war. The vast majority were French. To manage this enormous population, the German military established a sprawling network of prison camps. These fell under 2 broad categories. Auflags, short for Offizierslager, held commissioned officers. Stalags, Stammlager, held enlisted men and non-commissioned officers. Camps were administered by the Wehrmacht's military district system and numbered accordingly. Stalag Luft camps, operated by the Luftwaffe, held captured Allied aircrews and were generally considered among the better-run facilities. In the early years of the war, conditions in many of these camps were tolerable, not comfortable, but survivable. German authorities, still riding the momentum of conquest, had access to food supplies drawn from occupied territories across Europe. France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Poland, and later Ukraine and the Western Soviet Union all fed the German war machine. Guards were well supplied. Rations, while not generous, were adequate. Discipline was firm, but not yet desperate. For Western Allied prisoners, the British, the French, the Americans who began arriving in larger numbers after 1942, the Geneva Convention functioned as a fragile but real shield. The International Committee of the Red Cross maintained a permanent delegation in Geneva that served as the nerve center for prisoner welfare. Neutral Swiss inspectors visited camps. Reports were filed. Complaints were lodged. It was imperfect, often slow, and sometimes ignored. But it existed. And alongside the inspections came something far more tangible, something that would quietly reshape the entire power dynamic inside German prison camps. The Red Cross parcel. The idea was simple. Since the detaining power could not always be trusted to feed its prisoners adequately, the Red Cross would supplement their diet directly. National Red Cross societies, American, British, Canadian, New Zealand, Indian, Argentine, assembled standardized food packages at packing centers in their home countries. These parcels were shipped by sea to neutral ports, most often Lisbon, Portugal. From there, they were loaded onto Red Cross-marked vessels and transported to Marseille or Barcelona. Railcars carried them north to Geneva. And from Geneva, the International Committee distributed them onward, by train, by truck, by whatever means still functioned, to prisoner of war camps across the Reich. It was a logistical operation of staggering complexity. At its peak, the combined American, British, and Canadian Red Cross programs moved approximately 15,000 tons of supplies per month. During the harsh winter of 1944-1945, that figure was raised to 20,000 tons to accommodate additional shipments of desperately needed clothing. Each American Red Cross food package, officially designated Prisoner of War Food, Package No. 10, was a uniform box measuring 10 inches by 10 inches by 4 inches, weighing 11 pounds. Inside, 1 pound of powdered milk, a package of 10 assorted cookies, 1 pound of oleomargarine, 8 ounces of cube sugar, 8 ounces of Kraft cheese, 6 ounces of K-ration biscuits, 4 ounces of coffee, 2 D-ration chocolate bars, 6 ounces of jam or peanut butter, 12 ounces of canned salmon or tuna, 1 pound of Spam or corned beef, 1 pound of liver pate, 1 pound of raisins or prunes, 5 packages of cigarettes, 7 vitamin C tablets, 2 bars of soap, and 12 ounces of C-ration vegetable soup concentrate. 1 parcel, 1 man, 1 week. That was the formula. And for tens of thousands of American airmen and infantrymen held behind German wire, that 11-pound box was not a luxury. It was the difference between survival and slow starvation. Because the food provided by the German authorities, the official camp ration, was never enough. A U.S. quartermaster dietitian who examined an official camp menu submitted through the Swiss protecting power stated bluntly, the food was insufficient to maintain life in a normally active person. The Red Cross parcel did not just supplement the German ration. It replaced it. It became the actual diet. And as long as the parcels kept arriving, men lived. But the parcels were only half the story. Because while American prisoners behind wire were unwrapping tins of real coffee and chocolate, the nation holding them captive was beginning to starve. Germany did not go to war hungry. It went to war with a plan, and that plan depended on conquest. From the earliest days of the Nazi regime, food was understood as a strategic weapon. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle remembered the starvation blockade of the First World War, the Allied naval cordon that had choked off Germany's overseas food imports and contributed to the collapse of 1918. More than 500,000 German civilians had died from malnutrition during that conflict. The memory was seared into the national consciousness. It would not happen again. So the Third Reich built its food security on a simple and brutal premise: take it from others. The Hunger Plan, developed by Herbert Back, State Secretary in the Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture, envisioned the systematic seizure of agricultural output from conquered territories, particularly the grain-producing regions of the Soviet Union. Occupied France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Poland were all folded into the German food supply network. Laborers were deported from these countries to work on German farms. Local populations were rationed into subsistence. The surplus went to the Reich. By the middle of the war, approximately 40% of the bread and meat consumed by the German armed forces and civilian population was produced in occupied territories or by forced labor drawn from those lands. Germany was not feeding itself. It was feeding off others, and for a time it worked. German civilian rations, while never lavish, remained adequate through the early war years. Soldiers at the front received a scientifically calibrated diet. The standard Wehrmacht field ration, the Halbisern, or iron ration, consisted of a 300-gram tin of preserved meat and 150 grams of hard bread. Mobile field kitchens, affectionately called Julas Cannon, goulash cannons, followed the troops and served hot meals when conditions permitted. Erbswurst, a compressed pea soup pellet that dissolved in boiling water in under a minute, had been a staple of the German military since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Canned tomato soup, tinned sausage, hard biscuits, margarine, jam, and 6 cigarettes per day rounded out the soldiers' intake. Elite units fared even better. Paratroopers received special combat rations, Kampfpacken for Fallschirmjäger, containing real canned cheese, ham, high-energy chocolate bars, instant coffee with powdered milk, and hard candy. SS field rations included a 4-day supply of gray rye bread, 6 to 10 ounces of canned meat or sausage, 5 ounces of vegetables, small portions of butter or hazelnut paste, coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. It was not luxury, but it was enough. And for the first 3 years of the war, Germany's logistical machine kept the food moving. Then the tide turned. Stalingrad fell in February 1943. The Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was encircled, starved, and destroyed. The Eastern Front began its long, grinding reversal. By the summer of 1943, the Red Army was pushing westward. One by one, the occupied territories that had fed the Reich began to slip from German control. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Poland. Each lost province was a lost granary. Simultaneously, Allied bombing campaigns intensified over the German homeland. The British bombed by night. The Americans bombed by day. Rail junctions, bridges, marshalling yards, and road networks were systematically shattered. The transportation infrastructure that moved food from farms to cities, from depots to front lines, began to disintegrate. The numbers tell the story with cold precision. In May 1944, the German domestic bread ration stood at 12,450 grams per rationing period. By August, it had fallen to 9,700 grams. By December, 8,900. By April 1945, it had collapsed to just 3,600 grams. In less than a year, the bread ration had been cut by more than 70%. Meat disappeared from civilian tables. Sugar was measured in ounces per month. Real coffee became a memory. In its place came Ersatzkaffee, substitute brews made from roasted chicory, ground acorns, beechnuts, barley, chickpeas, or oats. These contained no caffeine. They offered no energy. They were warm brown water dressed in the language of normalcy. Bread itself was adulterated. Various fillers, sawdust, potato starch, ground chestnuts, were mixed into loaves to stretch dwindling grain supplies. What came out of bakery ovens in the winter of 1944 bore little resemblance to the dense, dark rye bread that had sustained German families for generations. The soldiers felt it too. On the Eastern Front, supply lines stretched beyond breaking. Tens of thousands of Wehrmacht horses, the backbone of German military logistics, which still relied heavily on animal transport, were slaughtered and eaten by starving troops. Men were instructed to live off the land. In a landscape already stripped bare by years of war, there was often nothing left to take. And yet, inside the wire, a different reality persisted. Every week, sometimes every 2 weeks when rail disruptions caused delays, trucks bearing the emblem of the International Committee of the Red Cross arrived at the gates of German Stalags and Auflags. They carried 11-pound boxes packed in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. Boxes containing real coffee, real chocolate, real meat, sugar that was not adulterated, milk that was not watered down, cigarettes that had crossed an ocean. At Stalag Luft 3, the sprawling Luftwaffe-administered camp in Lower Silesia that held thousands of Allied airmen, the official German ration provided approximately 1,600 calories per day. A U.S. military assessment noted that this was barely enough to keep a small child active. Without the Red Cross parcels, the prisoners would have withered. But the parcels arrived. And when they did not just feed the men inside the wire. They created an invisible economy, a parallel world of abundance that existed within a nation consuming itself. The guards saw it all. They stood at the gates when the trucks came through. They watched the boxes being unloaded, counted, and distributed. Under the Geneva Convention, they were obligated to deliver these parcels to the prisoners unopened, though each box was inspected for contraband. The guards slit the tins open to prevent hoarding and to check for hidden tools, radios, or escape materials. But they could see what was inside. They could smell the coffee. They could recognize the chocolate. And they knew, with the quiet, corrosive certainty that hunger brings, that the men they were guarding ate better than they did. Better than their families at home. Better, perhaps, than their comrades dying on the Eastern Front. No one recorded the exact moment a German guard first stood silent watching an American prisoner unwrap a tin of Spam. There was no single incident, no dramatic confrontation. It was a slow, accumulating truth, felt in guard towers and mess halls and barracks across the Reich, that the war was not just being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost at the dinner table. They were not the soldiers Germany had sent to conquer Europe. By 1944, the men assigned to guard Allied prisoner of war camps were drawn from the margins of a military machine running out of bodies. Many were older reservists, men in their 40s and 50s, too old for frontline combat, pulled from civilian life and handed a rifle they barely knew how to maintain. Others were wounded veterans, men who had lost fingers, toes, or partial use of limbs on the Eastern Front and been reassigned to rear echelon duty. Some were members of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, a desperate late-war formation that conscripted boys as young as 16 and men as old as 60 into service. These were not ideologues standing at the wire out of conviction. Many were simply tired men doing what they were told, counting the days until the war ended or the Americans arrived, whichever came first. And they were hungry. Their rations had been declining steadily since 1943. By the winter of 1944, a guard stationed at a Stalag in central Germany might receive a daily allocation of dark bread stretched with fillers, a thin soup made from turnips or cabbage, a small portion of ersatz coffee that tasted of burnt acorns, and if he was fortunate, a few grams of margarine or a sliver of hard sausage, 6 cigarettes, if supply allowed, no chocolate, no coffee, no meat worth the name. Then the Red Cross truck would arrive. The guards were required to oversee the distribution. They opened each tin to inspect for contraband, slicing through cans of corned beef, puncturing lids of powdered milk, cutting into bars of chocolate. The smell alone was a provocation. Real coffee, real cocoa, canned salmon. These were not items available anywhere in the crumbling Reich. Not in shops, not in military depots, not on the black market at any price most men could afford. They handed the parcels through the wire and walked back to their posts. No one needed to speak. The silence said everything. For the American prisoner of war, life behind German wire was defined by a single relentless constant: hunger. The official German ration issued to prisoners was a study in calculated insufficiency. At Stalag Luft 3, the most well-documented of the Luftwaffe-run camps, posts received approximately 1,600 calories per day from German-issued food. A fifth of a loaf of dark bread in the morning, sometimes smeared with a thin layer of margarine. A bowl of watery soup at midday, usually boiled potatoes, turnips, or cabbage with trace amounts of meat that might have been horse, might have been something less identifiable. Occasionally, a small portion of barley or millet. In the evening, another thin slice of bread, perhaps with a spoonful of beet jam or a shaving of ersatz cheese. A U.S. quartermaster dietitian who reviewed these menus concluded without ambiguity, this diet was insufficient to maintain life in a normally active person. The Red Cross parcel changed that equation entirely. When parcels arrived on schedule, 1 box per man per week, daily caloric intake could rise to a level that sustained health, maintained body weight, and preserved mental sharpness. The contents were not gourmet. Tinned Spam, powdered milk reconstituted with cold water, hard biscuits, liver pâté spread on ration crackers. But they were real food, produced in American factories, packed with calories and nutrients that the German-issued ration simply could not provide. Prisoners organized their consumption with military discipline. Men formed small groups called combines, typically 4 to 8 individuals who pooled their parcels and cooked communal meals over makeshift stoves, fashioned from tin cans and scrap metal. Recipes circulated through barracks. A man who could turn Spam, powdered milk, crushed biscuits, and a tin of jam into something resembling a cake was treated with genuine respect. But beneath the improvisation lay a stark awareness. Every man knew that without those parcels, he was slowly dying. The German ration alone was a countdown, not to rescue, but to organ failure. When the parcels arrived, men lived. When they did not, during the disruptions of late 1944 and early 1945, when Allied bombing severed the rail links that carried Red Cross supplies, men starved. It was that simple, that brutal, that dependent on a cardboard box packed 6,000 miles away. The fact that any parcel reached any prisoner inside the Third Reich was by any reasonable measure extraordinary. Consider the journey. A standard American Red Cross food package No. 10 began its life in a packing facility in the United States, most commonly in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or New York. There, assembly lines staffed largely by civilian volunteers measured, packed, and sealed the 11-pound boxes according to exact specifications. Each package was identical. Each contained the same items in the same quantities, down to the gram. From the packing centers, parcels were loaded onto trucks, transported to East Coast ports, and shipped by convoy across the Atlantic Ocean through waters patrolled by German U-boats. Losses at sea were a constant risk, particularly in the early war years when the Battle of the Atlantic was at its most ferocious. Entire cargoes of Red Cross supplies went to the bottom. Those that survived the crossing arrived at neutral ports, most often Lisbon, Portugal, or Gothenburg, Sweden. From Lisbon, parcels were transferred to Red Cross-marked ships and transported to the southern French port of Marseille. From there, rail cars carried them north through occupied or contested territory to Geneva, Switzerland, the operational headquarters of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Geneva was the bottleneck. It was also the control point. From this neutral city, the ICRC coordinated the final leg of distribution, loading parcels onto rail cars and trucks destined for individual camps across Germany, Austria, Poland, and the occupied territories. Each shipment was tracked. Each camp's prisoner count was monitored. Inspectors accompanied deliveries when possible. At its peak, the combined Allied Red Cross operation moved 15,000 tons of supplies per month along this fragile chain. During the winter of 1944-1945, When the need for additional clothing became desperate, the volume was increased to 20,000 tons monthly. It was a lifeline stretched across a continent at war, vulnerable to bombing, U-boats, rail disruptions, bureaucratic obstruction, and theft, and yet it held. Month after month, year after year, the parcels came through, not always on time, not always complete, but enough to keep men alive who would otherwise have perished in silence behind the wire. The guards who watched those trucks arrive understood something that no propaganda broadcast could overwrite. The enemy, the nation their government told them was decadent, weak, and doomed, could project logistical power across an ocean, through a war zone, into the heart of the Reich itself. And they could do it carrying chocolate. Inside the wire, something remarkable happened, something economists would study for decades after the war ended. Every American Red Cross parcel contained 5 packs of cigarettes. For many prisoners, tobacco was a comfort, a small pleasure that dulled the edges of captivity. But for the camp as a whole, cigarettes became something far more significant. They became money. In the absence of any recognized currency, prisoners of war across German Stalags and Auflags organically developed a functioning economy based on cigarettes. A tin of Spam had a price, measured in cigarettes. A bar of chocolate could be traded for a specific number. Powdered milk, coffee, soap, jam, every item that arrived in a Red Cross parcel was assigned a value by collective consensus, and that value was denominated in cigarettes. The system was not unique to any single camp. It emerged independently across dozens of facilities, wherever Red Cross parcels were distributed in sufficient quantity. Economists later identified it as one of the clearest real-world examples of commodity. Money, a medium of exchange that arises naturally when traditional currency is absent and a universally desired good fills the vacuum. But the cigarette economy did not stop at the wire. Guards, underpaid, underfed, and increasingly demoralized, became participants. A German sentry who had not tasted real coffee in months might quietly accept a handful of cigarettes or a small tin of meat in exchange for a favor. A blind eye turned at roll call, a message passed to another compound, a letter smuggled outside official channels. In some camps, guards traded information for chocolate. In others, they bartered their own meager rations, a loaf of fresh German bread, a bottle of local beer, for American cigarettes that had become more valuable than Reichsmarks on the black market. The power dynamic shifted without a single order being given. The men with the guns needed what the men behind the wire possessed. And in that silent exchange, a tin of corned beef passed through a fence gap. A pack of Lucky Strikes slipped into a coat pocket. The architecture of captivity quietly inverted itself. The prisoners did not become free, but they gained leverage. And leverage in a prison camp was its own form of survival. To understand the full weight of what the Red Cross parcel meant, you must look at the men who never received one. The Soviet Union had not signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. Nazi Germany used this as justification, legal cover wrapped around ideological contempt, to deny Soviet prisoners of war virtually every protection the convention prescribed. Soviet POWs were not registered with the International Committee of the Red Cross. They were not visited by neutral inspectors. They were not issued parcels. They were, in the eyes of the Nazi regime, subhuman. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, roughly 3.3 million died in captivity. They perished from starvation, disease, exposure, execution, and forced labor. In some camps, Soviet prisoners were kept in open-air enclosures, no barracks, no latrines, no shelter, through the Russian winter. They ate grass. They ate bark. They ate each other. The death rate in Soviet POW camps during the winter of 1941-1942 exceeded 50%. American and British prisoners existed in an entirely different universe, not because of German benevolence, but because of an international legal framework and a logistics network that the Soviets were excluded from by politics, ideology, and war. At Stalag 3B, this divide became physically visible. American POWs, flush with Red Cross supplies, accumulated surplus food, more than they could consume in a week. Nearby, Soviet prisoners were dying of hunger. American prisoners began smuggling food through the wire to the Russian compounds, tins of meat, packages of biscuits, whatever could be passed without detection. The German authorities discovered the transfers and responded with confiscation. Surplus food held by individual American POWs was seized. The official German ration was cut, punishment, ostensibly, for violating camp regulations. But the real offense was something the guards could not articulate in any official report. The Americans had exposed a truth that the entire camp system was built to obscure, that the difference between life and death was not determined by strength or courage or even loyalty to a cause. It was determined by a signature on a piece of paper in Geneva, 16 years before the first bomb fell. The Soviets starved. The Americans ate Spam, and the only thing separating them was a legal technicality wrapped in barbed wire. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich had arrived at a contradiction so profound it could not be resolved by propaganda, by force, or by ideology. Germany was a nation that had conquered most of Europe. It had fielded the most technologically advanced military machine the world had ever seen. Its armies had reached the gates of Moscow, the banks of the Volga, the shores of North Africa. Its engineers had built rockets that could cross the English Channel in 5 minutes. Its scientists had split the atom. And it could not feed its own people. The domestic food supply system, already strained by 4 years of total war, was collapsing under the combined weight of lost territory, destroyed infrastructure, and the relentless mathematics of a two-front conflict. Bread rations had been slashed. Meat was vanishing. Sugar was measured in grams. The ersatz substitutes that filled German cups and plates, the acorn coffee, the sawdust bread, the turnip soup, were not nourishment. They were theater. The appearance of sustenance in the absence of the real thing. Meanwhile, behind the wire, American prisoners of war opened cardboard boxes packed in Philadelphia and found real coffee, real chocolate, real canned meat, and real cigarettes. Not because Germany permitted it, but because an international system demanded it, and because the nation producing those parcels had the industrial capacity, the agricultural surplus, and the logistical reach to deliver them across an ocean, through a war zone, into the belly of the enemy. This was the paradox that silenced the guards. It was not simply that the prisoners ate better. It was what the eating revealed. The Red Cross parcel was not just food, it was evidence. Evidence of an economic and industrial disparity so vast that no amount of military genius could bridge it. Evidence that the war was already lost, not in the skies over Berlin or the fields of Normandy, but in the quiet mathematics of caloric output and supply chain resilience. A nation that cannot feed its soldiers cannot win a war. A nation that cannot feed its prison guards while its prisoners eat chocolate has already lost one. The guards knew it. They could taste it, or rather, they could taste its absence. And so they stood at the wire in silence, watching 11-pound boxes tell them a truth their commanders refused to speak aloud. The war was over. The paperwork just had not caught up yet. January 1945, the Red Army was closing from the east. The Western Allies were pressing from the west. And between those two advancing walls of steel, the Third Reich was being crushed into an ever-shrinking corridor of territory, a corridor still holding hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners of war. The German High Command faced a decision: leave the prisoners in place and risk their liberation by advancing Soviet forces, a propaganda disaster and a loss of potential, bargaining leverage, or move them westward, deeper into the interior of the Reich, away from the front lines. They chose to move them. And in that decision, the final chapter of the POW ration story began. On the night of January 27, 1945, the order came to evacuate Stalag Luft 3. Temperatures outside the camp had plunged to -15 degrees Celsius. Snow lay thick across the Silesian landscape. The prisoners, approximately 10,000 Allied airmen, most of them American and British, were given between 30 minutes and 2 hours to gather whatever they could carry and assemble in the compound yards. There was no transport waiting, no trucks, no trains. The men would walk. They walked into the frozen darkness carrying whatever remained of their Red Cross parcels, tins of meat stuffed into pockets, chocolate bars tucked into waistbands, packets of cigarettes distributed among the group as emergency currency. Some fashioned crude sleds from bedboards and loaded them with pooled supplies. Others filled pillowcases and slung them over their shoulders. Every ounce mattered. Every calorie was a step further from death. The guards walked with them. The same older men, the same wounded veterans, the same hollow-faced reservists who had stood at the wire watching parcels being distributed. Now they trudged through the same snow, carrying the same hunger, facing the same wind. The rifles on their shoulders felt heavier with each mile. Some guards carried less food than the prisoners they were marching. The forced marches of January through April 1945, known collectively by POWs as the Black March or the Long March, were among the most harrowing episodes of the entire prisoner of war experience. Columns of men stretched for miles along frozen roads, moving westward in ragged, staggering lines. They slept in barns and churches and open fields. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers. Dysentery swept through the columns. Men who fell behind were sometimes shot. Others simply collapsed in the snow and did not get up. The marshes were not unique to Stalag Luft III. Across eastern Germany and occupied Poland, dozens of camps were evacuated in the same weeks. Stalag 3B, Stalag 8C, Stalag 20A, Offlag 64. Thousands of prisoners from each facility were turned out into the winter and marched toward an interior that was itself disintegrating. Some columns marched for days, others marched for weeks. The distances varied: 30 kilometers, 60, 150, depending on the route, the weather, and the whims of the guards and local commanders who controlled the pace. And on these roads, the last distinction between captor and captive began to dissolve. The Red Cross pipeline, that extraordinary logistical chain stretching from Philadelphia to Lisbon to Geneva to the camp gates, had been severed. The same bombing campaign that was winning the war for the Allies had destroyed the rail network that carried their own humanitarian supplies. Trucks could not reach camps that no longer existed. Parcels stacked in Swiss warehouses had no trains to carry them forward. The lifeline that had kept men alive for years snapped, not through malice, but through the indiscriminate mathematics of total war. Without parcels, the prisoners were thrown back onto the same starvation rations as everyone else in the dying Reich. A few hundred grams of bread per day, if bread could be found. Frozen potatoes dug from fields. Raw turnips pulled from farmyard stores. Snow melted for drinking water. Whatever a man could scavenge, barter, or steal from a countryside that had already been picked clean. The guards ate the same. In some columns, the distinction between guard and prisoner became almost theoretical. Both were starving. Both were freezing. Both were walking toward an uncertain destination, through a landscape being torn apart by artillery and airstrikes. The rifles remained, but the authority behind them was evaporating. A guard who could not feed himself had little leverage over a prisoner who had nothing left to lose. Accounts from survivors describe scenes that would have been unimaginable 12 months earlier. Guards approaching prisoners to ask, not demand, but ask, for a cigarette. Sentries accepting a shared tin of cold meat in exchange for allowing a rest stop. In some columns, guards and prisoners walked side by side in silence, united by exhaustion and the shared understanding that the war was ending and that survival was now the only objective that mattered to either side. Not all guards softened. Some grew more brutal as discipline collapsed. Men who feared what would happen when the Allies arrived and who lashed out in anticipation of their own judgment. Beatings occurred. Summary executions were reported in several columns. The line between order and chaos wavered from hour to hour, from guard to guard, from one frozen crossroads to the next. But the broader pattern held. The forced marshes stripped away the last structural inequality between the men with rifles and the men without them. Without Red Cross parcels, the Americans were no longer better fed. Without functioning supply lines, the guards were no longer agents of a functioning state. Both were refugees of a collapsing empire, moving through a landscape that no longer belonged to anyone. The marshes converged over the course of weeks on camps deeper within the shrinking Reich. Some prisoners were funneled into Stalag 7A near Moosburg, Bavaria, a camp originally built for 10,000 men that, by April 1945, held over 80,000. Conditions were catastrophic. Overcrowding was beyond anything the camp infrastructure could sustain. Sanitation collapsed. Disease spread unchecked. Food, German issue, or Red Cross was virtually non-existent. On April 29, 1945, lead elements of the United States 14th Armored Division reached the gates of Stalag 7A. The camp was liberated after a brief exchange of fire. Inside, American, British, French, Soviet, and other Allied prisoners, gaunt, filthy, many of them barely able to stand, emerged into daylight and the sound of English spoken without a German accent for the first time in months or years. Among the first things the liberating troops distributed were rations, American military rations, K rations and C rations, packed with the same industrial abundance that had filled the Red Cross parcels: meat, bread, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes. The former guards, now prisoners themselves, watched from the other side of the wire. The inversion was complete. The men who had stood in silence watching Americans eat chocolate were now the ones standing in line, waiting to be fed by the army of the nation whose prisoners they had guarded. The rifles were gone. The towers were empty. The only thing that remained unchanged was the hunger and the quiet, corrosive knowledge that the war had been lost long before the last shot was fired. It had been lost in the space between an 11-pound cardboard box and an empty German mess tin. And everyone, guards and prisoners alike, had known it all along. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the arithmetic of captivity could at last be counted in full. And the numbers were staggering. Across the European theater, approximately 93,000 American servicemen had been held as prisoners of war in German camps. The majority were Army Air Forces personnel, bomber crews and fighter pilots shot down over occupied Europe and the Reich itself. Others were ground troops captured during the campaigns in North Africa, Italy, France, and the final battles inside Germany. They had been spread across a network of more than 50 permanent camps, transit facilities, work detachments, and hospitals stretching from the Baltic coast to the Austrian Alps. Of those 93,000, the vast majority survived. The overall mortality rate for American and British POWs in German custody was approximately 3 to 4%, a figure that, while representing thousands of individual tragedies, stood in stark contrast to the catastrophic death rates suffered by Soviet prisoners. The reason for that disparity was not German mercy. It was the Geneva Convention. It was the Swiss protecting power. It was the International Committee of the Red Cross. And above all, it was the 11-pound cardboard box. The American Red Cross, working in conjunction with the ICRC, shipped approximately 27 million food parcels to prisoners of war in Europe during the course of the war. 27 million boxes, each one packed in the United States, shipped across the Atlantic, routed through neutral territory, and delivered by rail and truck into the heart of enemy-held Europe. The British and Canadian Red Cross societies contributed millions more. The combined weight of humanitarian supplies moved through the Geneva pipeline over the course of the war exceeded 250,000 tons. These are logistical figures. They do not capture what those parcels meant to the men who received them. The U.S. Military Intelligence Service, in a report prepared in July 1944, a document that assessed conditions across the German POW system with clinical precision, concluded that Germany's treatment of American prisoners measured against the Geneva Convention, could be described as fair, not good. Not poor, fair. The report noted that compared with Japan's treatment of Allied prisoners, Germany's conduct was excellent. Compared with American treatment of German POWs held in the United States, where prisoners received full American military rations, access to recreation, educational programs, and in some cases more comfort than they had known in their own army, Germany's treatment was poor. The report identified a critical dependency. American POWs in Germany were, in its assessment, living on the Red Cross food parcels granted them weekly. The German-issued ration was not a supplement to the parcels. The parcels were a supplement to a ration that could not sustain life. Without them, the system would have produced mass starvation among Western Allied prisoners, a humanitarian catastrophe that would have mirrored, in miniature, the fate of Soviet POWs. For the men who came home, the physical toll was measurable but varied. Prisoners who had received regular Red Cross parcels throughout their captivity often returned in surprisingly decent physical condition, underweight, certainly, and weakened, but without the severe malnutrition or organ damage that characterized longer-term starvation. Those who had endured the forced marshes of early 1945, when the parcel pipeline was severed, returned in far worse shape. Rapid weight loss, chronic dysentery, frostbite injuries, untreated wounds, and the early stages of diseases associated with severe caloric deprivation, pellagra, beriberi, scurvy, were documented among liberated prisoners. The psychological toll was harder to quantify, but no less real. Men who had spent months or years behind wire, subject to the monotony, the powerlessness, the constant low-grade anxiety of captivity, carried invisible wounds that did not heal with liberation. The term barbed wire psychosis entered the medical vocabulary during and after the war to describe the cluster of symptoms observed in long-term POWs: irritability, difficulty concentrating, emotional withdrawal, hypervigilance, and a pervasive distrust of authority. Many returning prisoners struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Marriages strained. Employment proved difficult. The war followed them home in ways that the welcome parades and newspaper headlines could not acknowledge. And yet, almost universally, the men who survived German captivity credited one thing above all others for their survival: the Red Cross parcel. In memoirs, oral histories, and official debriefings recorded in the months and years after liberation, the parcel appears again and again as the single most important factor in sustaining life behind the wire. Not the Geneva Convention, though it provided the legal framework. Not the Swiss inspectors, though they provided oversight. Not the German authorities, who provided, by their own military's admission, a ration insufficient to sustain a normally active human being. The parcel, the box. 11 pounds of food packed by civilian volunteers in an American warehouse, shipped across an ocean and delivered into the hands of a man who would have died without it. For the guards who had watched those parcels arrive week after week, the aftermath carried a different weight. Many of the older reservists and Volkssturm members who had staffed the camp towers were themselves taken into Allied custody after the surrender. Some were processed through the same POW system they had once administered, now on the other side of the wire. Now the ones waiting for food, now the ones dependent on the decisions of a foreign military power to determine whether they would eat. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. Germany did not begin to recover when the war ended. Germany began to starve when the war ended. The collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945 did not simply remove a government. It removed the entire infrastructure of food production, distribution, and rationing that had, however inadequately, kept a nation of 80 million people alive through 6 years of total war. The occupied territories that had supplied 40% of Germany's food were gone. The rail network was shattered. The farms were depleted, stripped of laborers who had been conscripted or killed, stripped of horses that had been eaten or requisitioned, stripped of fertilizer that had been diverted to explosives production years earlier. The fields were cratered. The granaries were empty. The bakeries had no flour, In the immediate aftermath of surrender, the occupying powers, American, British, French, and Soviet, inherited a humanitarian catastrophe of immense proportion. Millions of German civilians were displaced, cities were rubble, and the food supply had functionally ceased to exist. Ration levels in occupied Germany plummeted to levels that made the wartime shortages look generous. In the French occupation zone, German civilians subsisted on as little as 900 calories per day, a figure that placed them below the threshold of slow starvation. In the British zone, rations hovered around 1,500 calories. Even in the American zone, where supplies were more abundant, the allocation for German civilians remained well below the minimum recommended for sustaining health. The food rationing system that the Nazi regime had imposed during the war did not end with the surrender. It continued under Allied administration until 1948 in the Western zones, and even later in some areas of the Soviet zone. For 3 years after the war's end, Germans queued for bread rations, received measured allocations of fat and sugar, and supplemented their diets with whatever could be grown in window boxes foraged from fields or obtained on the black market. The former prison guards, those older men and wounded veterans who had stood at the wire watching American POWs unwrap tins of Spam and coffee, returned to this landscape. Those who were not held in Allied prisoner of war camps themselves came home to families surviving on turnip soup and black market potatoes. The ersatz coffee they had drunk during the war was still the only coffee available. The adulterated bread was still the only bread. The hunger that had begun behind the guard towers followed them home and stayed. For some, the irony sharpened into bitterness. Men who had served their country, not as fanatics, not as war criminals, but as ordinary soldiers assigned to unglamorous duty, found themselves in a post-war world where the defeated ate less than the prisoners they had once guarded. The American POWs had gone home. They had returned to a nation where food was abundant, where factories ran at capacity, where the agricultural surplus that had filled Red Cross parcels continued uninterrupted. The guards had gone home to ruins. The cigarette economy, born behind the wire, migrated into the broader German post-war experience. In the chaos of occupation, with the Reichsmark rendered effectively worthless by hyperinflation, and the collapse of state authority, cigarettes became the de facto currency of daily life across occupied Germany. American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, carried the highest value. They could buy food, fuel, medicine, clothing, shelter, and favors of every description. A single carton of American cigarettes was worth more than a month's official wages. Economists who later studied the phenomenon traced its origins directly to the prisoner of war camps. The cigarette economy that had emerged organically inside the Stalags, where Red Cross parcels provided a steady supply of the universally desired commodity in the absence of functional currency, had been a small-scale rehearsal for what would happen across an entire nation when its economic system collapsed. The POW camps in this sense were not just prisons. They were economic laboratories, microcosms of a society reduced to its most fundamental transactions. The memoirs and oral histories of surviving American POWs, recorded in the years and decades after liberation, return again and again to the theme of the guards' silence. It was not a single dramatic moment. It was an accumulating condition, a quiet that settled over the camps as the war ground toward its end, a quiet that spoke louder than any confrontation. Milton Stern, an American POW, whose memoir of life in a German camp was preserved in the Library of Congress, began his account with a series of lists, foods he wanted to eat, books he wished to acquire, before moving into vivid descriptions of camp life that captured the peculiar social dynamics between prisoners and guards. Other accounts, preserved through the Veterans History Project and the archives of the Stalag Luft, 3 former prisoners of war association, describe the same phenomenon from different vantage points. The guard who lingered too long watching a parcel distribution, the sentry who quietly accepted a cigarette with a nod that contained neither gratitude nor hostility but something closer to resignation, The commandant who cut German rations when Red Cross parcels arrived, not out of cruelty, but out of a bureaucratic logic that assumed the prisoners no longer needed what the Reich could no longer provide. These were not stories of dramatic confrontation. They were stories of quiet erosion, the slow, wordless dissolution of authority that occurs when a system can no longer deliver on its most basic promises. A government that cannot feed its soldiers. An army that cannot feed its guards. A guard who watches his prisoner eat chocolate and says nothing, because there is nothing left to say. The war had many endings. The surrender on May 8, 1945, was only the most visible. For the men who stood at the wire, on both sides, the war ended in small private moments. A tin of coffee opened in silence. A cigarette passed through a fence. A look exchanged between two hungry men who understood, without words, that the uniforms they wore had become irrelevant. What mattered was the food. What mattered was who had it and who did not. And in the final winter of the Third Reich, the answer to that question told the story of the entire war. Wars are measured in territories taken and battles won, in treaties signed and borders redrawn, in the names of generals and the dates of surrenders. But sometimes, the truest measure of a war is found in the smallest details. A cardboard box, an empty mess tin, and the silence between two men standing on opposite sides of a wire fence. The story of the German prison guards who fell silent watching American POWs receive better rations is not a story about food. It is a story about the lie at the center of every empire that overreaches, the lie that conquest can sustain what production cannot. Germany built a war machine that consumed a continent. It fed that machine by taking from others. The grain of Ukraine, the dairy of Denmark, the labor of millions forced to work fields they did not own in a country that was not theirs. And when the conquests reversed, when the occupied lands slipped away one by one, the machine began to eat itself. The Red Cross parcel did not win the war. No 11-pound box ever stormed a beach or liberated a city. But it revealed something that bombs and bullets could not: the fundamental asymmetry between a nation that could produce surplus in the middle of a global conflict and a nation that could not feed its own guards in the middle of its own territory. The parcels were quiet witnesses to an industrial truth. America did not just outfight Germany. It outfed it. It outproduced it. It reached across an ocean, through submarine-infested waters, and bombed out rail networks, and placed a tin of coffee in the hands of a prisoner standing inside the borders of the Reich. And Germany could not match that act with a single loaf of unadulterated bread for the man holding the rifle 6 feet away. There is no monument to this story, no plaque on a wall. No ceremony held each year to mark the moment a guard watched a prisoner eat chocolate and understood that the war was lost. These moments do not lend themselves to bronze or marble. They live in the quieter archives, in the handwritten diaries of men who counted calories to stay alive, in the oral histories recorded decades later by veterans whose voices still tightened when they described the taste of Red Cross coffee in a frozen barracks, in the unwritten memories of German guards who carried the weight of that silence for the rest of their lives. What this story teaches is not a lesson about good and evil. The prisoners were not saints. The guards were not monsters. Most were ordinary men, caught on different sides of a catastrophe not of their making, separated by barbed wire and a cardboard box and the vast, invisible machinery of nations at war. The lesson is simpler than that, and older. A nation that cannot feed its people cannot claim to lead them. A war that starves its own soldiers is a war already lost. And when the men holding the rifles fall silent because the men behind the wire are eating better, the end is not approaching. It has already arrived.